The moment she opened her door to the gaunt stranger shivering in the dusk, Della's small, forgotten life was over. He was a creature of sharp angles and deeper shadows, his clothes fine but tattered, his eyes holding a desperate, hunted look that resonated with a loneliness she knew in her own bones. She was a baker's dismissed assistant, a woman so quiet and plain the world had decided she was invisible. But this man saw her. And in the cold, silent nights that followed, as she shared her meager supper with him without question or demand, something ancient and powerful began to stir in the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. But what no one knew, least of all Della, was that her simple bowls of soup were not just feeding a vagrant. They were healing a king. If you believe that a single act of quiet compassion can reignite a heart that has been cold for 1,000 years, type kindness below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, to that cracked wooden door with the fate of an empire shivering on her threshold, you need to know about Della. She was a creature of quiet corners and soft noises. An orphan raised by the parish, she had learned early that to be unnoticed was to be safe. She had a talent for bread, a feel for the dough beneath her hands, a sense of when the yeast was breathing just right. For 5 years, this talent had earned her a place in the town bakery. She was never praised, but she was kept. That was enough. Until it wasn't. The baker's wife, a woman with a voice like shattering glass, had dismissed her a week before. "You have no presence, girl," she'd shrieked, her words echoing in the flour-dusted air. "Customers don't see you. You're like a ghost, bad for business." The baker himself had just shrugged, unwilling to cross his wife for the sake of a silent girl who made the best sourdough in the county. So Della was sent away with a few coins and a final, pitying loaf of her own bread. She retreated to the tiny cottage her apprenticeship had afforded her, a stone and thatch box at the very edge of the village, where the lane gave way to the gnarled, unwelcoming arms of Blackwood Forest. The forest was a place of dark local legend, dominated by the spires of Blackwood Manor, a place no one had been invited to in living memory. The master of the house, Lord Valerius, was a phantom. An old name on a deed, a whisper in the tavern. Some said he was a recluse, mad with grief. Others, in hushed tones after their third ale, said he was something far older and more dangerous. They said the chill that sometimes crept down from the woods on a summer's night was his breath. They said the deer that were sometimes found, still and pale with no mark upon them, were his prey. Della paid the whispers no mind. The world of men had hurt her more than any ghost ever could. She spent her days tending a small patch of herbs and her nights by the fire, reading the one book she owned, a tattered collection of folk tales. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion she had long since stopped trying to fight. Then he appeared. It was a Tuesday. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving a bruised, purple twilight. A sharp knock, unusual and startling, echoed on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one ever came to her cottage. Ever. Hesitantly, she drew back the bolt. And there he was. He was tall, impossibly so, and leaned against the doorframe as if it were the only thing holding him upright. His face was all sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was gaunt, hollowed out by a hunger that seemed to go deeper than flesh. His dark hair was matted with grime and leaves. His eyes, a deep shadowed gray, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in her life, utterly and completely seen. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a portrait of ruin and desperation, a faint, unnatural cold seeping from him into the mild evening air. Della saw the fine make of his torn coat, the hint of a signet ring on his dirt-caked finger. This was not a common vagrant. This was a man who had fallen from a great height. Her heart, a thing she had guarded so fiercely, cracked open with a pang of pure, unadulterated pity. She knew what it was to be hungry. She knew what it was to be alone. Without a word, she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. He moved slowly, stiffly, his body crying out with a pain he refused to voice. He sank into the single wooden chair she kept by the hearth, his long frame seeming to absorb what little light and warmth the room possessed. The shadows in the corners of her cottage seemed to deepen, to crawl a little closer to him. Della turned to the pot simmering over her fire. It was a simple vegetable soup, meant to be her dinner for 2 nights. Beside it sat a small, crusty loaf of bread she had baked that afternoon in her tiny hearth oven. It wasn't much. It was everything she had. She ladled the soup into a bowl, her hands steady. She tore the loaf in half and placed it beside the bowl on a wooden plate. She set it on the small table in front of him. He stared at the food, then up at her. His throat worked, but no sound emerged. A tremor ran through his hand as he reached for the spoon. He ate with a slow, desperate urgency that spoke of days, perhaps weeks, of starvation. Della said nothing. She simply sat on her stool on the other side of the hearth and watched the fire, giving him the dignity of not being observed in his moment of need. When he was finished, he pushed the bowl away. He looked at her again, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of something impossible in his eyes, a faint, ruby-red glow, like the last ember of a dying fire. Then it was gone. He rose, gave her a stiff, formal nod that seemed utterly out of place on a starving man, and walked out into the night. The next evening, at the exact moment the last sliver of sun vanished, he was there again. The knock was the same. The desperate silence was the same. The profound cold that clung to him was the same, and Della did the same. She let him in, gave him her soup and her bread, and sat in silence while he ate. This became their ritual. Every dusk, he would appear. Every dusk, she would feed him. He never spoke a word. She never asked for one. She began to bake a larger loaf each day. She added more vegetables to her soup, using the herbs from her garden. She found herself thinking of him during the day, wondering where he went, where he slept. The ache of her loneliness began to be replaced by a different feeling, a quiet, anxious anticipation. She noticed small changes in him. The hollows in his cheeks seemed less severe. He moved with a little less pain, a little more grace. The tremor in his hands vanished. He still wore the same tattered clothes, but he seemed to fill them differently. The most startling change was in his eyes. The dull gray was slowly, day by day, being consumed by that strange, luminous crimson, now less like a dying ember and more like a banked furnace, and stranger things began to happen around her cottage. The shadows in her home seemed to have a life of their own, stretching and pooling in ways that defied the candlelight. They felt protective. One afternoon, the baker's son, drunk and belligerent, came stumbling down the lane, intent on causing trouble for the spinster girl. He got within 20 feet of her gate before the shadows under the eaves of her roof deepened into an inky, impenetrable black. He stopped, his face paling, and backed away, muttering about a sudden chill and eyes in the dark. Della felt no fear. The darkness felt like an extension of the silent man who came each night. It felt like his gratitude, made manifest. One night, about a fortnight into their ritual, he finished his meal and did not immediately rise to leave. He sat there, his hands resting on the table, his crimson eyes fixed on her. The candlelight flickered and guttered, though there was no draught. The air grew heavy and cold. He spoke for the first time. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, like the tolling of a distant bell, rough with disuse. "Why?" The single word hung in the air between them. Della looked down at her hands, then met his gaze. Her own voice was soft, but clear. "Because you were hungry." A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, crossed his face. He seemed to be searching her for a hidden motive, an angle. He found none. He simply found Della. "You have little," he stated, his gaze sweeping over her sparse, clean cottage. "Yet you gave it to me." She shrugged, a small, simple movement. "I had enough." He studied her for a long moment, his stillness absolute, inhuman. It was like watching a statue. "You did not ask my name. You did not ask where I came from." "It didn't seem to matter," she said honestly. "You needed help." A strange, sad smile touched his lips. It was a fleeting, heartbreaking expression that transformed his severe face for just an instant. Then he stood, gave his customary nod, and was gone. The next night, he did not come. Della waited, her soup growing cold. The sky turned from violet to indigo to black. The moon rose. The chair by her hearth remained empty. A knot of cold fear, sharper than any she had felt for herself, tightened in her stomach. Had something happened to him? Had he finally succumbed to whatever had broken him? She barely slept, her ear tuned to the slightest noise. But there was only the sound of the wind in the trees. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt empty again. The brief purpose that had filled her days was gone. She was just Della again, the forgotten girl in the cottage at the edge of the woods. She was just about to resign herself to the familiar ache of loneliness when she heard it. The sound of carriage wheels on the lane. And not just any carriage. This was the heavy, crunching sound of a formal coach, drawn by a team of horses. It stopped directly in front of her gate. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She peered through her small window and gasped. It was a carriage of polished black lacquer, trimmed in silver, drawn by 4 immense black horses whose breath plumed in the cool morning air. The crest on the door was a silver wolf's head against a black field, the crest of Blackwood Manor. The carriage door opened, and he stepped out. But it was not the broken stranger from her doorstep. This man stood tall and straight, radiating an aura of power that was so immense, so palpable, it seemed to bend the very air around him. He was dressed in immaculate black, a tailored coat of fine wool over a waistcoat of dark silk. His hair, clean and gleaming, was tied back with a simple leather cord. His face was no longer gaunt, but regal and severe, handsome in a way that was both breathtaking and terrifying. And his eyes were the color of fresh blood, glowing with an inner light that was utterly inhuman. It was him, and it was not him at all. He walked to her gate, his movements fluid and silent. He did not knock on her door. He simply waited. Behind him, villagers began to peek out of their homes, their faces a mixture of fear and astonishment. The baker and his wife stood in the doorway of their shop, her mouth agape. Della's hand trembled as she opened her door. She stepped out into the morning light, her simple wool dress a stark contrast to his aristocratic perfection. He looked at her, and the whole world seemed to fall away. His crimson gaze was not cold. It was intense, possessive. "Della," he said, and her name in his resonant voice was a physical touch. "I have come for you." She could only stare. Who are you?" A faint smile played on his lips. "I am the man you fed when the world had left me for dead." He extended a gloved hand. "I am Lord Valerius of Blackwood." The murmurs from the village grew louder. Lord Valerius, the phantom of the manor, the dark legend. And he was here, in the daylight, at the cottage of the invisible girl. He was here for her. Della looked at the hand he offered. It was a choice. Stay here, in the world that had dismissed her, or step into the darkness that had shown her more kindness than the light ever had. She looked past him, at the face of the baker's wife, contorted with shock and envy. She looked at the other faces, the people who had never given her a second glance, and then she looked back at him, at the man whose life she had saved with soup and bread. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and cool. A jolt like lightning shot up her arm. He led her to the carriage, his presence a shield against the gawking stares of the village. As he handed her inside, he leaned close, his voice a low whisper for her ears alone. "You will not want for anything ever again." The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was a silent, dizzying dream. The plush velvet seats, the smooth roll of the wheels, the imposing figure of Lord Valerius sitting opposite her. He did not speak, but his eyes never left her. It wasn't a threatening gaze. It was watchful, curious, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had never encountered before. The manor was not just a house. It was a fortress of gray stone and black slate, a collection of towers and spires that clawed at the sky. It brooded over the landscape, ancient and formidable. As they passed through the immense iron gates, Della felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was a place of immense power and deep sorrow. Inside, the manor was a cavern of shadows and silence. Vast halls with ceilings lost in darkness, floors of polished marble that reflected the flickering candlelight like pools of black water. There were no servants. The great doors swung open before them of their own accord. Candelabras lit as they entered a room. The air was cold, scented with old stone, beeswax, and something else, something metallic and ancient. Valerius led her through a labyrinth of corridors to a vast library. Bookshelves soared 2 stories high, crammed with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in, casting a warm, dancing light over the room. It was the only truly warm place she had felt in the entire manor. He gestured to a pair of deep armchairs near the fire. "Please, sit." Della sank into the soft leather, feeling small and overwhelmed. He remained standing, a towering silhouette against the flames. The shadows in the room seemed to cling to him, to obey him. They were not just an absence of light. They were a presence. "You have questions," he stated. It was not a question. She nodded, finding her voice. "You were hurt, starving." "I was," he confirmed. "Cursed." He began to pace, his movements unnervingly silent. "There are others like me. old, powerful, and like any creatures of power, we have rivalries. One such rival, a being of considerable cunning and cruelty, found a way to strike at me. An old magic, a curse that bound my nature, stripped me of my strength, and tethered me to the frailties of a mortal body. His crimson eyes burned with a cold fire. I could not hunt. I could not command the shadows. I was cast out of my own home, weakened, dying. The curse had a condition, an escape clause designed to be impossible. My power would only be restored if I received an act of pure, selfless charity. Not pity, not a transaction. An offering given with no expectation of reward, from a heart that sought nothing in return. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. My rival believed such a thing no longer existed in this world. He believed I would wander the lands, starving and weak, until I faded into nothing. He almost succeeded. He took a step closer, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. For weeks, I stumbled through the darkness, shunned, feared. I could feel my life, my very essence guttering like a cheap candle. I was drawn to your light, to the quiet warmth of your cottage. I did not know why. I knocked on your door, expecting to be driven away one last time before the end. He paused, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of centuries. And then you opened it, and you fed me. Della's heart ached for the broken man he had been. She finally understood the ritual, the slow return of his strength. Her simple kindness, her unquestioning compassion, had been the key. It had been the antidote to a poison forged from cynicism and hate. The curse is broken, he continued, but its shadow remains. I am not yet at my full strength. My rival will know I have survived. He will come. He will seek to finish what he started. He finally sat in the chair opposite her, leaning forward, his intensity a physical force. I brought you here for 2 reasons, Della. The first is to honor my debt. You saved my life. This house and everything in it is now as much yours as it is mine. You are its mistress. You will be protected. You will be safe. His voice dropped lower. The second reason is, I need you. The curse was broken by your nature. Your presence. It soothes the lingering poison. It strengthens me. It is a light in the endless dark of my existence. He looked at her, his regal facade cracking to show the vulnerable man beneath. I am asking you to stay, willingly, to help me face what is coming. The truth of his words settled over her. He was not just a lord. He was a king of this hidden, nocturnal world. The vampire king, just as the darkest whispers in the village had claimed. He was offering her sanctuary, wealth, protection. But he was also asking for her help, admitting his own vulnerability. He was not commanding her. He was asking, would you have stayed, knowing you were living with a creature of the night, with a war on the horizon? Would you have accepted the safety of his world, knowing it came with such danger? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Della looked around the magnificent library, at the firelight glinting on the spines of 1,000 books. She thought of her tiny, empty cottage. She thought of the baker's wife's sneer. She thought of a lifetime of being invisible. Here, in this house of shadows, with this impossible ancient man, she was seen. She was valued. She was necessary. She met his intense crimson gaze without flinching. I will stay. A wave of relief so profound It was almost visible washed over him. The tension in his shoulders eased. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat, to soften. For the first time, he gave her a true, genuine smile. It lit up his face, chasing away the centuries of sorrow and revealing a beauty that was sharp and breathtaking. "Thank you, Della." And so her new life began. A life of quiet days and long, strange nights in the heart of Blackwood Manor. Valerius gave her a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire cottage, with a soft bed piled high with velvet blankets and a balcony that overlooked a vast, moon-drenched garden of night-blooming flowers. Her days were her own. She spent hours in the library, her fingers tracing the spines of books on history, poetry, and sciences she'd never dreamed of. She discovered she had a hunger for knowledge that matched the hunger for food she had once known. She would lose herself for hours, curled in the armchair by the fire, the silence of the manor a peaceful blanket around her. But it was the nights she began to live for. Valerius would appear as the sun set, a silent, graceful presence. They would often dine together in a smaller, more intimate study. At first, their meals were silent, reminiscent of their first meetings. But slowly, she began to ask him questions, and he began to answer. She asked about the books in his library. He would speak of the poets he had known, the philosophers he had argued with centuries ago. His knowledge was not academic. It was lived. He spoke of watching the great cathedrals of Europe being built stone by stone, of seeing empires rise and fall like tides. He, in turn, asked about her. He wanted to know everything, about her childhood in the orphanage, her love of baking, her quiet observations of the world. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel like the most fascinating person alive. He never pitied her. He seemed to admire her resilience, her quiet strength. "They called you a ghost," he said one night, his voice laced with a cold anger. "Fools. They were the ones who were blind." The cold that had once radiated from him was now a controlled part of his presence. When he was near, the air would cool and candles would flicker, but it no longer felt like a harbinger of death. It was simply him. The shadows remained his constant companions. They would stretch to pull a book from a high shelf for her, or dim the candles when the moonlight was bright enough to read by. They were his servants, and they had accepted her as their mistress. One evening, she found him in the night garden. It was a place of impossible beauty, filled with pale, silver-white roses, moonvines, and jasmine that released their intoxicating scent only after dark. He was standing by a fountain, the water murmuring over stone, staring up at the moon. She walked to his side. For a long while they stood in companionable silence. "They are called Queen of the Night," he said, his gaze on a large white blossom. "They only bloom in darkness." He reached out, his long, pale fingers brushing against a petal with surprising gentleness. "I have always felt a kinship with them." He turned to her, his crimson eyes soft in the moonlight. "You are not like them. You do not need the darkness to bloom. You carry your own light." Without thinking, Della reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His coat was cool wool, but beneath it, she felt a surprising, living stillness. He froze at her touch. It was the first time she had initiated contact since she'd taken his hand at her cottage gate. He looked down at her small hand on his arm, then back to her face. His expression was one of profound, aching vulnerability. He slowly raised his own hand and gently, tentatively, covered hers. His skin was cool, like marble, but not lifeless. A current, a quiet energy passed between them. It was more intimate than any kiss. "Della," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. In that moment, under the silver light of the moon, surrounded by the scent of jasmine, she knew she was no longer just his ward or his savior. The feeling that had been growing in the quiet corners of her heart finally had a name. It was a dangerous, impossible, terrifying love. He saw it in her eyes, and she saw it reflected in his. A love that was just as terrifying and just as impossible for him. A vampire king, who had lived 1,000 years in solitude, was falling for the quiet baker's girl who had seen the man inside the monster. But their fragile, burgeoning peace was destined to be shattered. The attack came without warning. It was a week later. A storm was raging outside, rain lashing against the ancient stone of the manor. Della was in the library, trying to distract herself with a book of poetry, but a sense of deep unease had settled over her. Valerius had been restless all evening, pacing the length of the great hall like a caged wolf. The shadows in the manor were agitated, writhing and twisting in the corners of her vision. The unnatural cold had returned, sharper and more biting than ever. Suddenly, the great window at the far end of the library exploded inward, showering the room in a cascade of shattered glass and freezing rain. A figure stood silhouetted against the stormy sky, a man who looked like Valerius's dark reflection. He had the same aristocratic features, the same inhuman grace, but his eyes were a flat, dead black, and his smile was a slash of pure cruelty. "Valerius," the man purred, stepping into the room utterly unharmed by the shards of glass. "I see the rumors were true. You survived. How disappointing." Valerius appeared in the library doorway in an instant, moving with a speed that was a blur to Della's eyes. He stood between her and the intruder, his body a rigid wall of fury. His crimson eyes blazed, and the shadows in the room coalesced around him, forming a writhing, menacing cloak. "Cassian." Valerius's voice was a low, deadly growl. "You are not welcome in my home." Cassian's dead eyes slid past Valerius to fix on Della, who was frozen behind the armchair. His cruel smile widened. "Ah, and this must be the little saint who saved you. How quaint. I must admit, I underestimated the depths of human sentimentality." He took another step into the room. "I came to finish what I started, Valerius, but now I see a much more entertaining path to victory. I will take her from you. I will break her, and then I will break you." A roar of pure, primal rage ripped from Valerius's throat. He launched himself at Cassian, and the two ancient beings met in a clash of impossible force. They moved faster than thought, a whirlwind of black and crimson. The air crackled with power. Books were torn from shelves, furniture splintered. It was a battle of gods, and Della was a fragile mortal caught in the middle. Valerius was stronger, but Cassian was cunning. He was using the lingering effects of the curse, finding moments of weakness to exploit. Della watched in horror as Cassian landed a blow that sent Valerius staggering back. "Hide, Della," Valerius commanded, his voice strained. But Della did not hide. She was not the invisible girl anymore. This was her home. This was the man she loved. She would not cower while he fought for her. Cassian, seeing her refusal, changed his tactic. He disengaged from Valerius and suddenly appeared before her, his cold hand gripping her arm. "Let's see what your little savior does when you are the one in pain," he hissed, his grip tightening like a vice. Della cried out, not in fear, but in anger. She looked into Cassian's face, and in his dead black eyes, she saw nothing. No pain, no love, no sorrow. Just a void. He was a perfect, polished surface of hate, and she remembered the stranger on her doorstep. She remembered the desperation and pain in his eyes. Valerius had been broken, but he had still been real. Cassian was hollow. "You don't understand him at all," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Cassian laughed. "Oh, I understand power, little mouse, and he is about to lose all of his." "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "You understand cruelty. You don't understand strength." She looked past him at Valerius, who was gathering himself for another attack, his face a mask of terror for her safety. His strength isn't in his power. It was in him even when he had none. It was in the man who was too proud to beg, but humble enough to accept help. Her words, spoken with such simple, unwavering conviction, struck Cassian in a way no physical blow could. He faltered, his arrogant composure cracking. He was a creature of manipulation and deceit, and her raw, honest truth was a language he couldn't comprehend. It was a light he couldn't endure. That moment of hesitation was all Valerius needed. With a final, guttural cry, he crossed the room. He was not just a king now. He was a primordial force. The shadows of the manor, every dark corner and sliver of night, answered his call. They surged forward, not as wisps of darkness, but as solid tendrils of tangible night. They wrapped around Cassian, holding him fast. Cassian struggled, his power useless against the very element Valerius commanded. Valerius stood before his trapped rival, his hand outstretched. "You tried to extinguish my light," he said, his voice echoing with the power of ages. "But you only showed me where to find a new one." He closed his hand into a fist. The shadows tightened, and Cassian let out a final, choked scream before dissolving into a swirl of dust and fading darkness. Silence descended on the wrecked library. The storm outside quieted. Valerius stood panting, the immense power slowly receding from him. He turned to Della, his crimson eyes filled with a desperate fear. He rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, her gaze never leaving his. "No." She reached up and touched his face. "Are you?" He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. A single perfect tear, red as a ruby, traced a path down his cheek. "No, not anymore." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate tenderness that spoke of 1,000 years of solitude finally ending. "You did not run." "This is my home," she whispered into his chest. "You are my home." A week later, the black carriage returned to the village. But this time, it did not stop at the edge of the woods. It rolled down the main street, stopping directly in front of the bakery. Lord Valerius stepped out, regal and imposing, but he was not alone. He turned and offered his hand to Della. She emerged from the carriage, not in her simple wool dress, but in a gown of deep blue silk that shimmered in the sunlight. Her hair was elegantly styled, and on her throat rested a simple, beautiful necklace with a single, tear-shaped ruby. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was radiant. She was a queen. The entire village had come out to stare. The baker and his wife stood in their doorway, their faces pale with shock. The baker's wife's jaw was slack, her eyes wide with disbelief and a bitter, consuming envy. She was looking at the girl she had dismissed as a ghost, now standing beside the most powerful man in the region, looking more real and more present than anyone on the street. Valerius's gaze swept over the crowd, cold and imperious. It rested on the baker's wife. "You told this woman she had no presence," he said, his voice carrying with unnatural clarity. "You were mistaken. You were simply too small to see it." He then looked down at Della, his expression softening into one of pure adoration for all the world to see. "I am hosting a ball at the manor to celebrate my return to public life. Della will be receiving our guests, as the Lady of Blackwood." He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, turned his back on the stunned village, and led her back to the carriage. The wound the baker's wife had inflicted, the wound of a lifetime of being overlooked, was not just healed. It was erased. Della had not needed their approval, but in that moment, seeing their shock, she felt a final, quiet sense of victory. She had been valued by the one person whose opinion truly mattered. Time passed. The autumn leaves fell, and winter blanketed the manor in a soft, quiet white. Life for Della settled into a rhythm of peaceful days and loving nights. She was the undisputed heart of the ancient house, her warmth and light filling every corner. The shadows were her gentle guardians, and the powerful, immortal man who ruled them was her devoted partner. One evening they sat by the library fire, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm securely around her. They had been reading in comfortable silence for an hour. "Della," he said softly, breaking the quiet. She looked up at him. His crimson eyes were serious, filled with a love so deep it was bottomless. "I have lived for more than 1,000 years. I have watched the world change, watched everyone I ever knew turn to dust. The thought of watching you do the same, it is the only thing I have ever feared." He took her hand, his cool fingers lacing with her warm ones. "I can offer it to you, an eternity, to see the ages with me, to never be parted." He paused, his grip tightening slightly. "But it is not a gift I can give. It is a choice you must make. Your life is precious. Your mortality is part of the light you carry. I will not be the one to extinguish it. I will love you for every day you have, whether it is 10 years or 10,000. Della looked into the fire, then back at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He would love her either way. He would stand by her choice, whatever it was. He had saved her from a life of invisibility, and now he was giving her the ultimate freedom, the freedom to choose her own destiny. She smiled, a slow, gentle smile filled with all the love in her heart. She raised his hand to her lips and kissed his cool skin. "We have time," she whispered. "Ask me again on the first day of spring." He smiled back, a true, happy smile that reached his ancient eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss filled with the promise of all the sunrises and sunsets they would share, however many they were granted. In the heart of the shadows, the forgotten girl had not just found love, she had found herself, and she was home. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of cold loneliness, and where being truly seen becomes the greatest power of all, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.